What I really want to start with is one basic idea, and as it says right here, this idea that story matters. It's crucial. Story has mattered to the human experience for untold millennia. It's the way that we've understood our world. It's the way we've attempted to pass down our information from generation to generation, for better or for worse, right? I mean, we have so many different traditions, from the caves at Lascaux to, the things that we see as traditional literature, to religious stories, to the things that shape our culture. Story does matter. And as you probably know where I'm going, story is also going to matter in video games, or at least that's the point that I would like to make. So what I want to do is back up a little bit, because I think what's important here is to talk about the idea of what makes a game. And then we'll move forward from this idea of what is a game to what is a video game, and what is an interactive system. And we'll kind of move on this timeline, and we'll mix story in with that. So, at its very beginning, we have this idea of a puzzle. Certainly not a game. If we want to look at what a puzzle is, it's something that's very much a technical operation. We have a singular solution. Very likely, it's something that one person is going to work on. You can certainly do it collaboratively, as with a crossword puzzle, but for the most part, there are particular limitations to this idea of a puzzle, right? We have a Rubik's Cube, and you can certainly take that to the nth degree. There are people who still do Rubik's Cube competitions to see how quickly you can do it, how efficiently you can do it. You can cheat by taking it apart, but ultimately it's still kind of a singular operation. And the same thing with a standard jigsaw puzzle. You put it together, it's done. There's one way to do it. And of course, one of these little finger trap puzzles as well. There's one way to get out of it. I mean, you could force your way through, but for the most part, there's one particular way. Now, what we do is there's a large shift between this idea of puzzle and game. A game can certainly have a puzzle as part of it, but it's less frequently that a puzzle will have kind of a game element, right? The two can certainly overlap. There's always that little bit, that area. But essentially, I move to something like chess, which is kind of our classic game, right? And I won't go too deeply into the quotes. I'll try not to make this too text heavy, but there are a couple of points here in this slide that I would like you to take away. This idea of voluntary control, the idea of as an opposition between forces, and this idea of procedure and rules. There have to be some rules to the game, or it's really not going to be much of a game, because then you're just arguing all day long. And this idea of a disequilibrial outcome, which essentially means that somebody wins, somebody loses. Whether you're playing that with another person, there's a winner or loser, or maybe you're playing against the computer, there is a winner or a loser. But that is going to be an integral part of this system. Or an artificial conflict, a quantifiable outcome. You kind of get the idea with that. And what's really interesting, though, and what I really think differentiates that, and you can see how these concepts work together, is chess takes it a step further, because chess does have a story. You're not simply trying to win or lose. You're not simply trying to determine what the next move is going to be. Different people will have sort of different levels, right? This is going to fall upon a paradigm. But ultimately, you have kings and queens. You have people who are battling. You have knights and rooks. You have this epic battle that is playing out on this board of 64 squares that could happen in an astronomical number of derivations, right? It's incredible. So you have this battle. You have these knights falling. And ultimately, that's what really grabs us. And if you look at a game of chess, you have two people facing each other. You have two opponents. You have this idea of both people wanting something. They make the first move. You have rising action. And as the game moves on, the tension builds. The action rises until finally you have this climax of action. And what we're looking at right there is a classic story arc that comes with every single game of chess. And this is what really grabs people. Certainly the technical operation, but this is a large part of it. Without that, chess is a radically different thing. So then we move forward a little bit, a few hundred years, to some games that maybe aren't quite as, what's the word I'm looking for? Lauded as chess, right? We have operation. Well, it's this idea of representing a subset of reality. This is another piece that really makes a game. Obviously, in operation, you're trying to get the bone or the organ out without shocking, which really means essentially killing the patient or causing some type of bodily harm. In Monopoly, you are in a capitalist utopia, right? Maybe not a capitalist utopia, but you know what I mean. You're trying to win. You're trying to come away with the most to have a monopoly. It's an analog to real life. The game of life, well, there it is right there. It is the game of life. It is its own sort of closed formal system, right? Everything that you need is there, and you don't need to reference anything outside of that to actually play a game. You certainly can. You can certainly be creative. You can play these in different ways, but as a general rule, there are in fact rules. Battleship, who sunk my battleship? You have global war, right? And then of course we have this helmet here, and for any gamer, we know this comes from Halo, and once again, you have these soldiers in the future and you have alien battles, and ultimately either you win or you die and you lose. But again, these represent some type of a subset of reality. So we move forward from analog games, which we can call those, our sort of classic board games that very easily, with the exception of Halo, could have existed without a computer, to something a little bit more complex, something where story really takes a central role. We have the original Dungeons and Dragons games where you have volumes and volumes of books on campaigns, on how to play, and theory on how to play. You have the sort of classical 20-sided die that you roll. You have this element of chance that's involved. You're playing as a bard or a mage, a magician or a warrior, right? And you're really part of that story. And you're starting to see kind of a heightening level of interaction that's coming. So you've gone from chess, where you're imagining, you're starting to go to these board games which are sort of handing you that little subset of reality, now to something even larger. It's almost like you're playing a book. You have Magic the Gathering. It's a role-playing game in its own sense. Every single card is its own character, and each one takes its own unique place within the gaming system. Again, you're getting more deeply involved. And you have something like Risk. It kind of toes the line between board game and chess, and something that we can at least project story onto. So you can see we start to become a little bit more complex as we move through these systems. We're kind of moving on this arc towards the idea of the digital. And then this is something that really interests me, and I see these as really the missing link between literature and games and video games. It's this idea of the choose your own adventure book. I'm not sure, has anyone ever actually had it? Okay, a few hands go. Fantastic, right? So you know what happens. Essentially, you have a story. You start off, and it's talking in the second-person point of view. It's talking to you. You are lying in bed. You wake up to an eerie green light. You look out your window, and you see a flying saucer. What do? Do you jump out the window and engage with the flying saucer? Turn to page 6. Do you run into your basement and hide? Turn to page 12. So what you should do is make your decision and turn to one. You've just created a branching decision. But what you normally do is actually put your finger in one page, look at it, put your finger in the other page, look at it, see which one is going to be the best, and say, okay. And generally, one of these choices kills you. Very frequently, right? But this is an early form of interactive media. I mean, you actually have branching narratives. Now, you could very easily do what you do in one of these in a wiki page now, very easily. Which direction you want to go? Click, there's your adventure, right? You don't even need to print these anymore. But you have that strong interactive element. You're able to, as it says, choose your own adventure. And it's taking the book from something that you're engaging with in a more passive way to something where you actually feel like you're making a choice. You at least have that illusion that you have control, that you're transforming that narrative. Again, that story is what is doing that for you. So then we skip forward and we go from Choose Your Own Adventure to some classic video games, right? And it's kind of interesting because we can look at the elegance of chess or, the artistry, some may say, that goes into Choose Your Own Adventure books, and we can flip over kind of the 8-bit revolution, right? We still have story, and in fact we have very strong story. Even if the gameplay is simple, it still exists, right? Mario, we have a plumber in the Mushroom Kingdom who wants to save the princess from the evil Koopa, right? You have a plot, you have a character, a protagonist, an antagonist. You have the Oregon Trail, again, another game where you frequently die. Zed has cholera, Zed has died, but you have a purpose. You're moving forward, there's tension, there's rising action. And Oregon Trail is very interesting because we'll be talking a little bit about gamification, but it's this idea of actually being able to learn something through your games, which is incredibly key, and which is another place that story actually matters. And then finally, we have games like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, where you're trying to determine these mysteries, right? So even though these are older games, and I'd like to start with these older ones just to essentially illustrate that as simple as they are, they make sure that story matters. Now, certainly something like Pac-Man, it's basic. It's very close to a puzzle. You have this little yellow guy going around devouring dots. But if you want to have fun with it, you can pretend that, I don't know, maybe the ghosts are actually protecting their eggs from this horrible creature that's coming, trying to destroy their society, right? You can go a lot of directions with it. And there's certainly a place for this idea of projected story as well. It can certainly be implied. And we tend to want to do that, the way we do with a game of chess. We're constantly projecting, or we have a combination of this projection of story plus the story that exists. And so ultimately, and this is a quote by a researcher by the name of Grant Tavenor in New Zealand, he has some really great writings on this idea of games, video games specifically, and story. But the two things I want you to take from this is that with a book, you physically interact with it and perform cognitive actions. You pick it up, you turn the pages, you think about it, you interpret it. You could even do some literary criticism from any number of schools that you want, Freudian, whatever you want to do. But with video games, this idea of this prop, this fictive prop, this thing that you hold in its hand, it's actually malleable and responsive. So you can actually change what is happening. You can actually jump from question mark to brick, and you can jump on top of a turtle, and you are actually making that happen. Whether or not the level is scripted, which it is, you still have that power within that system to make something happen, and you can control that story. So moving forward, and really kind of around the same time frame, we have this idea of the Zork games, the Infocomm games. And I'm not sure if anybody here has played any of these. These were really big in the 80s. So we have a couple hands that go up. These are incredibly fun. You can find them in emulators online. There were Zork 1 through 3, Planetfall and Stationfall, and there was a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game like this, which was one of the most frustrating games I've ever played, but it was fantastic. But this is essentially it. It's a screen with text. It is, at its core, an interactive story. West of house, you're standing in an open field west of a White House with a boarded front door. There is a small mailbox here. And then just a prompt. And you have to say, look around, go north, go south, what is in the room? And you have to start gathering information about what's happening in your environment. You have graph paper, you're pulling that out and you're actually graphing on a grid where you go. You're creating maps, you're writing down on another piece of paper what your inventory is. It stores it, but you can't just click and see what it is. And you're building the story in your mind, and you're actually interacting with a piece of fiction as the story unfolds. And it has its own antagonists, and it has its own allies that you can team up with. So when we really talk about interactive fiction, here's where we go, right? I mean, this is kind of the beginning of it, and it's very, very much at its core. Fun games, you should definitely check them out. They're very engaging and consuming, or at least they were the last time I played them, which is probably a long time ago. So just this idea that with traditional fictions, in a way, we're passive observers, and again, this idea that with video games, they're active pursuits, right? And certainly I'm not equating games and literature to a sports baseball game that you're playing on the Wii or with the Kinect, but the point still stands that it is an active pursuit, and we're engaged because of that story, because of that tradition, those thousands of years that we have of understanding our world through those paradigms. And really what it comes down to this is video games are interactive fictions, and video games are, in a sense, little machines that create fiction. And yes, we have limitations of the programmers and of the game creators, but within that, we have a wide number of options, whether it's a sandbox game, whether it's a first-person shooter, whether it's an MMO, massively multiplayer online game, we still have this idea of an interactive fiction machine, and there's so much we can do within that. So now there are two ways that we can look at this, right? So we can look at story and we can look at structure, right? So there's this term, Ludology. It's this idea of looking at the game in terms of structure, levels, psychological reward schedules, the things that you get, the power-ups, the little rewards, right? It's like when you're on Facebook and you see the little one comes up that says, oh, you have a message, great, right? It's this reward system that kind of lights up our brain. Then there's this idea of narratology, and these two exist simultaneously. And narratology basically means story. And what we're focusing on largely here is this idea of narratology, but essentially the two work in concert with one another to make very strong, very addicting, very malleable gaming experiences. And so we look at this, and I'm not going to get deeply into psychology, but if we want to think about Ludology, we can think about form, and we can also think about the psychological side of things, right? We have Pavlov here, ring the bell, you salivate. Classical conditioning, we have operant conditioning, which is essentially much more active. You learn that when you press the lever, you get food, right? It's kind of like playing a game of cards. There's this random chance, this random element, but you're the one who is rewarded, and your behavior is transformed. That sort of fits into Ludology, and that's great, because this is incredibly important in video games. It keeps us coming back, certainly, and these can exist completely aside from story. Other things, if we want to look at that ludological lens, are all the things that are very common to games, right? Leveling up, progress bars. I know if I hit this with a crowbar, I'm going to get something. There's my life meter. There's a badge that I just got. Yes, I've gone up another level. I love these little rewards. They make me feel better about myself. It can be sound. This idea of kind of mastering a skill. They lay that skill out in front of you. You've learned it. Fantastic. That's part of the structure of a game. But on top of this, it's this idea of narrative and having a story and a component that we can actually follow. And so basic story, right? What it comes down to is somebody or something attempting to achieve or gain something, encountering blockages to that desire, trying to overcome those blockages, and coming to some kind of a resolution. That is story at its absolute basic core. There's generally rising action, a climax where the action peaks, then following action and some kind of a resolution. Or if you want to look at it from more of a screenplay standpoint, this idea of setup, complications, and resolution. But you'll see this arc in a lot of different places, and it'll look a little bit different. You can say, oh, well, there's one rising action, a climax, and it goes down. And then there's more, and then there's more. And so this can have a number of different lumps and peaks and valleys, depending on how complex the story is, depending on how many characters you have in the story, or in fact, in the video game that you're playing. And the reason I put Snow Crash up here, it's kind of fun. It's a great book by Neil Stephenson, but he actually, his protagonist's name is actually Hero Protagonist, which is great. I just love the way he kind of flipped that around. Great book if you haven't read it. So what are some of the elements of story? I'm going to look at this. I wish I could look at it from every possible lens. I'm really going to be talking about some traditional story elements. Kind of touch on this idea of postmodernism, but it tends to be a little bit more experimentation if you actually want to make a postmodern video game with a postmodern story. But one does exist, and we'll talk about that. But from its more classical side of things, of course, we need character. We need somebody to play. It's an avatar. We need somebody to identify with. We need somebody to help us. We need somebody to play against in a game, and whether that character is Link or whether that character is a little spaceship shooting single pixels. It's something that represents who we are. Setting comes into play, incredibly powerful, especially in video games where the choice of a color in a background can act to transform your mood. Very important. We want a villain or an antagonist or something trying to block. This can be more of an abstract concept. If we have the Mario games, obviously we have King Koopa here who is trying to stop us at every cost. But it's that idea of we want to achieve something. This is the guy who stops it. We want something. We want that Maltese Falcon. We want that MacGuffin. We want whatever that object is, whether it's rings, whether it's power, whether it's a new weapon, pretty much you name it. We need something that we want to achieve, some object of desire. We have conflict. This comes into play. We try to get something, somebody stops us. That's where conflict happens, and we can play with that concept. And then ultimately, we have change. And that is huge to remember that change, because we can have all these other elements here, but if we get to the end of the story and we don't have some type of a change, which could simply be life or death, we haven't really fulfilled our story, right? I mean, we see Harry Potter aging. He transforms from an innocent kid to essentially the chosen one. Classic story arc. We think of Han Solo, or at least we've all seen that kind of Han Solo character, whether it's Guardians of the Galaxy or Star Wars. It's the hard-edged guy who's out on his own and he's smuggling and he doesn't need anyone. Well, by the end of the story, he'd better have at least reformed just a tiny bit. He falls in love, or he realizes that teamwork matters, or something along those lines. Well, there's the change in that character. And within stories and within video games, if we want to make something that really engages us, we want to have that change. And whether that's in one character, just your protagonist, and if we want to make it more interesting, we can have your antagonist, and we can have other sort of non-player characters doing that. So some other things that matter, right? So we have our characters and we have our pieces. Dialogue matters, certainly matters in literature, and it certainly matters in a really good video game. We can certainly, stop in the village square and we can talk to a non-player character who tells us some secrets. Here's where the sword is, here's where the potion is, whatever it is. We want to make that good. We want to make that matter. There's nothing like in all your base are belong to us to kind of pull us out of the action, right? You can laugh about it, it becomes funny and we post it online, etc. But if we really want to be engaged and involved, we really need to think about this idea of dialogue. Stakes in jeopardy, and this one is incredibly important, and this relates to a couple other things, right? We have a picture of a guy gambling here, and he's got a bottle, and he looks pretty miserable. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be misery, but a lot of the times it is. And The best way to define it is this: stakes. You are gambling, right? And are you gambling for pennies with some of your friends in a dorm room, or are you a James Bond villain and every single hand in your game is $10,000 or $1 million? The stakes are how much that amount is. The jeopardy is what that means to you. So it's $10,000 a hand poker, you're the James Bond villain, whatever, I burn that in my sleep, whatever that is. But if you are, say, a father who is gambling with your children's college fund, the jeopardy is going to be much higher. That means a lot more. And this idea of throwing stakes and throwing higher, and more jeopardy at your characters, this is a way to build tension and to really make a page turner, right? So we have that. And it's interesting, there was the author Kurt Vonnegut, and it relates to it, is it was a talk at the University of Iowa Writer Workshop, and he was talking about writing, and his idea is that in writing you better be doing one of two things at all times: developing character or moving the story along. If the two things that you're writing don't do that, don't bother with it, right? A great way to move the story along: good dialogue and really strong stakes. You keep throwing problems at this person. You keep making their life more and more miserable. You give them more things to eventually overcome. Oh my gosh, what happens next? Man, you're turning those pages. And in a video game, it gets more and more intense as you play. If the stakes and the jeopardy always stayed the same, you'd probably get really bored of the game really quickly. Stakes and jeopardy together, that creates your tension. It's this idea of wanting one thing and wanting to achieve something else. That's where tension exists. We want to maintain that. And then finally, the idea of themes. They're really strong. There are a lot of games out there that have strong themes, whether it's environmental or whether it's political. And I'll talk about one or two of them as we get a little bit further into this presentation. But these are all going to work together, right? If you kind of have that toolbox and you're saying, I want to create a good video game, what can I do with these pieces? So we move on, and really what it comes down to is that the game character is us. It's an avatar. It represents who we are, and it's a surrogate for ourselves. It's kind of interesting. You look at these old Atari games like Pitfall. The game itself, you don't have much. It's awful. But if you want to look at the cover art, or if you're in an old-style arcade and you look at the cabinet art, it shows story. It's not simply, oh, look, here's a blip shooting another blip at someone else. Here's somebody and he's flying over these alligators and there's gold in the background and oh my gosh, there's something hidden underneath there. How incredibly cool is that, right? And it's the story that's really selling us on these games. So then character, we get a little bit more deeply into this. We've talked about protagonist, and we've talked about antagonist, and what our characters are doing, and the fact that we want our characters to change. And what's really important is to elicit emotion, to know what our goals are, but to have identification. We need to somehow identify with the character. We can identify through gender, we can identify through politics, but there are a couple other things that are really important, especially when it comes to a game. And I like to use a lot of examples from movies. So we can identify with a character who we think is like us. So we can talk about Spider-Man, right? Okay, the classic story. He's kind of a skinny kid. He's in high school. He gets picked on a lot. He's incredibly brilliant, but he's always dealing with the jock. And eventually he's bitten by the radioactive spider. He's very powerful. He beats up the jock, right? That's one of the main parts of the original Spider-Man story. Yes, fantastic. I can relate to that, right? We've just related to this character. Now you're along the ride for him. You can identify with somebody who you would want to be, somebody you think is fantastic. I wish I were like Superman. I wish I were Master Chief or Lara Croft. It's amazing the things she can do. All right, go Lara, right? Or we can identify with a character's situation. This person feels trapped. This person grew up in a terrible environment. And so when we look at somebody like Harry Potter, gosh, he's a fantastic conglomeration of all of those things. Yes, we absolutely love Harry Potter because, oh, I've so been there. You know, I feel like I was kind of an outcast as a kid, and oh my gosh, I wish I were a magician, and this situation, I know what it feels like to be metaphorically kept under the stairs, right? So we relate to him on all of those levels, and man, that's fantastic. And now we can sign on with this character. Again, we translate into some type of a game. If we can even touch one of those ideas, you're going to be far more prone to go along for that ride. So what I want to talk about is mythic structure. There are other ways that we can certainly form a story. I think this is one of the most interesting. Again, I like to use movies as examples, and we're going to be moving into video games here in a couple minutes, I promise. But it's just so incredibly obvious in a number of movies. Star Wars is one of the biggest ones where we see mythic structure, and you'll understand why in a minute. The Matrix, completely ripped from mythic structure. The same thing with the Batman movies, at least. What does this mean, right? If you're interested in learning a lot about mythic structure, I'll take kind of a quick aside, learn about Joseph Campbell. He taught at Sarah Lawrence College, and he was the expert on mythic structure. The Hero with 1,000 Faces and The Power of Myth are two of his sort of seminal books. Certainly worth a read if you want to know more about what I'm about to talk about here. This is certainly a quick overview. But it's this idea that there's a structure. And think about this in games that you played, and think about it in movies that you've seen, right? So we have the ordinary world. We have Luke Skywalker on Tatooine. He's moisture farming. Things are pretty boring. He wishes he were in space. There's a call to adventure. Oh my gosh, what's this little robot? Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Let's investigate this, right? He meets a mentor that's down over here. These things can happen slightly out of order. He meets Obi-Wan Kenobi. He refuses the call. No, I'm not going to go out into space. He comes home, and his aunt and uncle have been fried by stormtroopers. Well, I have nothing else to do. Fine, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go explore the universe. Fantastic. So he's crossed that threshold. He's gone through Mos Eisley. He goes into space. They're tests, they're allies, they're enemies. He learns how to become a Jedi. He fights that little remote control thing. He meets Leia, he meets Chewbacca and Han Solo. Eventually he meets Yoda. This keeps happening in each episode. You approach the innermost cave. Well, the innermost cave is very much the Death Star in these movies. There's a supreme ordeal and finally a reward, right? You face off against that ultimate foe. You blow up the Death Star, you finally get something, you take the road back, and you're reborn as somebody new. He is no longer Luke Skywalker kid. He is Luke Skywalker budding Jedi, and you return with the elixir, which can be metaphorical. Either you return with a real bottle of something magic, or you just return as a conquering hero. The classic hero's journey in one slide, and you can see this everywhere. It works in video games, it works in books, it works in movies, it's all over the place. We'll give some examples in a minute here. So again, there's our mentor. There are mythic characters who exist within this. We talked about meeting the mentor. Well, of course, there's Obi-Wan Kenobi. There's the guardian of the threshold, the person who says, you shall not pass, and you have to determine how to pass. That could be physical combat. That could be something that the hero has to deal with. We have the herald, the person who brings the world to the new person. We have this idea of the shadow or shapeshifter. This harkens back to Jungian psychology if you want. But essentially, if you're a male, your shadow is female. If you're female, your shadow is male. It's this idea of kind of opposites. We tend to get this idea of the femme fatale very frequently in media. Because of this, we very infrequently see this idea of kind of the male version of the femme fatale, which I think we need to see more, to be perfectly honest. We have the hero in the center. We have the trickster. You can find trickster myths dating back thousands of years in dozens and hundreds of different cultures. And finally, we have allies. And these are all the people who come along with you. Basic mythic structure. So then we can look at certain video games, and we just see this written all over them, right? We have Assassin's Creed, we have Skyrim, the Elder Scrolls, which is very much your standard, I am a hero, I am fighting dragons to become dragonborn, to become part dragon, I have magic, I've created alliances, I'm having these conversations, I'm constantly dealing with this tense structure. We have something like Max Payne, which is kind of one of the worst plots ever, but it still goes along with that. It's this idea like, oh, I'm this hard-boiled, hard-nosed cop, and oh, I can't go back in the field. Oh, fine, all right, I will, right? He refused the call. Instead, he decides to go along with it. He makes allies until it comes to this climax in the story. These are much very story-based games. These aren't our Pac-Man. These aren't our standard first-person shooters, but it certainly applies. But if we have this type of a sandbox, if we have the ability to work with these sort of more complex, kind of very 3D, very, very large-scale games, we have an easier time of actually applying that story. It's possible, and it's certainly possible in simpler games as well. So then the question is, how do we apply story to something that has nothing to do with this? So I found this guy, right? We've probably all seen the meme, coffee house barista guy. And I was thinking, okay, well, how does mythic structure matter? Okay, so here we are, setting. One day we're in a coffee shop, and this guy's sitting there drinking coffee, and someone else is behind the bar pulling shots. The guy behind the bar either has a heart attack, leaves angry, and this guy's a regular, and the manager says, hey, have you ever, pulled shots before? Do you want to come behind and help me? And he says, no, I couldn't do that. I'm too busy. I've got something else going on. He says, oh, come on. All right, he hops behind there. So he had the call to action, he had the refusal to the call, and he just had the herald come and say, come into this new world of pulling espresso shots behind the counter. He makes friends, allies, and enemies, maybe people who are delivering beans, people from other coffee shops, the regulars who come into the coffee shop. He comes against different types of tests, perhaps in the movie or the video game that comes through this. There's some type of a puzzle, or there's some type of a system where you're actually trying to pull the perfect shot. You're changing your temperature and the amount of coffee and the type of roast, and you try to put it in front of a particular character. Maybe you have an end boss who is coming from a large corporate chain, and you're trying to show that your sort of small local roast is better, right? So you're taking this hero's journey and you're plunking somebody into it, and you're transforming this, and you're creating your own story and your own game. So the moral there is certainly don't think that this is only these kind of Conan the Barbarian type stories. You can actually go very far with mythic structure. So I said I would talk about a couple things briefly that don't fall into standard mythic structure. Who's played the Stanley Parable? Okay, great. So there's a fantastic free just teaser version that you can download that will make you want to play the rest of the game. It's a very postmodern game, and by postmodern I mean that it's very self-reflexive. It talks about itself. The entire time that you're playing, you have this sort of ridiculous, almost Monty Python sounding narrator reminding you that you're in a game, and the things that you are about to do are very typical for a game, and oh look, here's an entire wall of buttons, which one are you going to press? And it pulls you through the game and it makes fun of it as you go along. And to be perfectly honest, there's no real point to the game, yet you play it just because it is so incredibly interesting. And if anything were to happen in the game that were even like mythic structure, the game would be flipping it around and making fun of it and making you doubt which character you were and who you are. Really interesting one. This is an author by the name of Jonathan Lethem, and he wrote a story called The Happy Man. And the story itself, very depressing, fantastic story, but it's about this not so distant future where people can die and come back, but then they have to go to hell for a certain period of time, and then they can come back. And so it's his story of kind of coming back and forth from our world and that world. The reason I'm talking about him is there's a place in his story where he has a son who's creating a video game about his father's story of coming back and forth from these two worlds. It's this sort of strange self-reflexive concept, right? And the video game itself is very interesting. And in the most recent course I taught here in literature and video games, we said, okay, well, what would that look like, right? How would we take his son's video game and sort of pull it out? And we played around with it. And you can kind of have a Stanley Parable adventure line type thing where there really is no story, or you can apply this mythic structure or the standard story arc to it and have it make a little more sense and have it be a little bit more engaging so you're not quite asking as many questions. So just some interesting stuff that pulls you out of there. Genre is very important. So we've talked about mythic structure, which is how you structure the story. That's how your hero moves along. We've talked about this idea of the narrative arc, where you have the setup and the complications and the resolution. Behave yourself. And so then within that, you have genre of story and genre of video games. And there's a lot of those, right? We have a few listed here. There's post-apocalyptic. That's huge. Everybody likes a good end of the world. Everything is terrible. You're sort of that last shining light, or that kind of Mad Max feel. Science fiction, Western, something like Red Dead Redemption. You have racing games, gritty survival in a city. Maybe it's something to do with urban warfare. You have comedy. You just have some fun. You have your standard fantasy, your World of Warcraft, your Ultima, those types of things. Or you can have a combination. Theoretically, you could probably have a sci-fi post-apocalyptic game with Western themes where you're racing cars in a gritty city with some comedy elements and some fantastical things going on. Absolutely possible. It'd probably be a really interesting game if you can figure out how to control it, right? You control it with a little bit of story, but That being said, again, right, World of Warcraft, that's huge. It's the quintessential MMO. It's the one that everybody researches, and it's the one that everyone's talked about, and it's the one that's lasted the longest. Before that, there was Ultima Online, there was EverQuest, or Evercrack, as people used to like to call it. Same concept. And the thing that's kept World of Warcraft going financially and from a thematic standpoint is they keep releasing these editions. Here's more story, more quests, more characters, and let's keep this rolling. Let's keep the mythic structure going as long as we can, right? We're going to upgrade this, we're going to upgrade the graphics. With those other ones, they didn't do that, right? They didn't go far enough with it, and you need to stick with it. And it's a serious task to keep generating new story and to keep generating new content, but it certainly made it successful. Some other games where we can see story or mythic structure at play. Fallout 2, we have the Chosen One traveling to a wasteland to save the home village. Well, there we go. There's our chosen one. There's somebody going on a quest. There's somebody who wants to bring back that elixir being more of a metaphor. How do I save my village in a post-apocalyptic nightmare? Bioshock Infinite. It's really interesting. It deals with race and clash, exceptionalism, facing one's demons, and there are actually some Ayn Rand undercurrents in there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too, depending on what we want to define as literature and games. And then again, Red Dead Redemption. This is our classic console Western. And this follows along the paradigm of so many other Westerns, which are very much an American myth of the hero, right? He's an ex-bandit who's been pushed back into the old life to hunt down his posse. Once again, you used to be this, you're not that anymore, you're sitting on your porch drinking whiskey, guess what, something happens, you're coming back into the life, and somebody pulls that person in, and there goes the mythic journey. And this person ends up fulfilling that in many different ways, shapes, and forms. So we deal with Portal, which is really interesting, right? Portal is one of the game phenomenons of the decade. It's huge. You can get your Aperture Laboratories bumper stickers. You can go to ThinkGeek and get whatever you want. Not trying to plug any particular company here, but all sorts of fun things. It's a pop culture phenomenon. And the interesting thing about Portal is if you take the basic gameplay, it's a puzzle. It's absolutely a puzzle. You know, if you've never, how many people have played Portal? Okay, great, good. So you know the concept. You have a portal gun. It starts out, you can only open one portal. The other one that you can kind of leap through is already there. As you get further on in the game, you can have both sides of portals. You're essentially creating your own wormholes, and you're solving puzzles by pressing buttons and dropping cubes and dealing with lasers and going to all these different areas. Those are puzzles on their own, but once we layer story onto it, it becomes incredibly engaging. You have this kind of strange, unreliable narrator. You have this sort of malevolent evil that you're fighting against. You're this person who's been asleep for who knows how long. You're thrust into this world to become this type of reluctant hero, right? And that's incredibly powerful. So, I mean, it truly is taking the mythic journey, and it's twisting something that used to be just a basic puzzle, an individual operation, into a pop culture phenomenon. You can create your own, and that's what really moves us along. And once again, this makes the game into more of a page turner if we were to take that metaphor from literature and apply it to video games. So this is a really interesting one, and you can do a lot of research on this one, but basically Bioshock is what is seen as an objectivist kind of nightmare world. It takes these concepts of this really sort of intense self-reliance, and it attributes it to this character. It takes the concept of Ayn Rand, turns it into a video game which you are then fighting through. It's this underwater world. It was supposed to be a utopia, and everything went bad. And it brings in these really interesting moral dilemmas, right? So number one, it's pulling directly from literature. But then number two, it's actually forcing you to make decisions. There are these little characters in there called the Little Sisters that if you choose to, you can basically suck the life out of them, killing them, adding to your own power, and it's a lot easier for you to get through the game. Or you can choose to save them instead of killing them, which actually gives you a different outcome in the game. So you're actually making a moral choice in a video game that at least has undercurrents of a piece of literature. It's very powerful. So we're actually getting past this idea of basic story, and we're actually grabbing thematic elements and we're running with them. And it says, hey, well, what if we were to take this in a video game, run with it, and take it to one possible outcome, which is incredibly powerful. And that's something we're going to get into in a moment as well. One of the last few points I'm going to make, we're going to talk about this idea of design fiction and sci-fi prototyping, where we can utilize story and games to sort of expand our thought processes. So we come to this idea of gamification, and this is one that really interests me, and it's one that's essentially the buzzword. I was at one of these talks last quarter, and they were talking about a project that's here at Stanford, this eTRNA, where essentially people are getting together and creating these RNA sequences and solving problems. I was incredibly impressed by this. It was a very enlightening talk. If you can find it, I would certainly suggest for you to look it up. But it's this idea of you have this game construct, and you're using the game to simulate, modify, transform, and ultimately learn something about the real world. So we can go to the Nike website, and they have the power band and training, and you can save what you're doing and your heart rate and how far you've run, and it takes that, and you have leaderboards. You could put that up against other people. You've just gamified your life, right? Because you can actually say, well, I've done 10,000 steps. Well, I did 20,000 steps. I bench pressed this. Oh, well, I did this. And you're actually getting those elements. If you remember those power-ups that we saw on that previous slide, that's what this is doing. Here's your leaderboard. Here are other people. Here's a way to save your points. Here's a way to sort of use this as a system of feedback to make yourself stronger. It's very much the ludological approach, right? With Nike, we don't necessarily have a story. You could certainly make your own. This is a car that I drive. It's a Honda Insight. It's a hybrid. It has its own gamified feedback. It's kind of difficult to see, but as you drive, it'll show you, oh, how well are you doing? Are you saving gas? And you have this little bar that goes back and forth. And if you've done really well, you get these little sprouts that come up, and they grow trees. And if you're driving really safely, if you're saving gas and you're being good on the gas pedal, this area turns green. If not, it turns blue. And you have this eco button, and you have all this input. And if by the time you've paid attention to that, you haven't crashed the car, it's actually giving you some type of real feedback. It's teaching you how to drive. And so when you hop into another car, you drive the way you did in this, and you're actually saving gas too, right? It's a gamified system. This is something, Chore Wars, right? You can gain experience points for housework. Oh, that's nice. Great, I took out the trash. I get 10 extra points. That's fantastic, and that's fun. What's really interesting, though, is then we kind of take this back, and this is actually a screenshot from a movie which was based off of a book called Ender's Game. And I think it's a fantastic example of gamification in sort of pop culture and in the movies, right? How many people have read Ender's Game? Okay, fantastic, right? So we know this story, right? We have this young boy who is essentially trained through these simulations, and, you know, spoiler alert, at the end you realize that it was all real. Sorry, everybody out there, if you haven't read the book, but it's gamification, right, at this incredibly high degree. I mean, he's been in a gamified system. He refused this call to adventure. He finally does it. He becomes the chosen one. We can mix any system we want together. You could certainly create your own Ender's Game video game, taking these elements, putting them together. You have that simulation. You end up having to do that final fight near the end. So one more concept I would like to touch on before we finish. Have just a couple more minutes left. So we've talked about this idea of gamification, improving ourselves. We talked about this idea of story. And one of the goals here, and one of the questions that I want to pose to you, is how can we merge those two together? Because we have those gamified systems, but they don't necessarily have story until we get to that kind of Ender's Game concept, right? There is something there. What if we can take this idea of the hero myth and we can merge it, right? We're taking the narratological and we're taking the ludological, and that ludological approach, that one of structure, the one of the power-ups, et cetera, is really where gamification exists right now. But how can we grab that narratological approach? And again, turn these gamified systems into real page turners, into things that we really just want to get engaged with. We can mix those two together in equal parts. So that's where we're coming. So one more concept, this idea of science fictions, design fictions and science fiction prototyping. We've probably all heard of this concept of design thinking. Well, it goes a little bit further. This guy right here, his name is Brian David Johnson. I had the pleasure to work with him a couple years ago. He is a futurist at Intel. His job is to use hard data as well as story to predict and to essentially work with the company to say, what are we going to be doing 10 years from now, 15 years from now? What is the technological landscape going to look like? Very cool job title. I wish I were a futurist working for Intel right now. That would be fantastic. And he actually works on something with other authors called the Tomorrow Project. And the idea is this, that our fiction, our sci-fi systems, these things that we can come with, can actually solve real-world problems. So whether we're using standard mythic structure or we're just writing short stories that have basic setup, complications, and resolution, and we don't go that far, what if we take a problem that we're having now? What if we're trying to get to Mars, or we're trying to deal with some type of a social issue, and we write these stories about it, and we pull them out in different directions, and we find different ways for our protagonists and our antagonists to work together and against one another, and we start finding all these different directions that we can go with the issue. A lot of science fiction prototyping comes from this 1945 wireless world. Arthur C. Clarke talks about geostationary satellites. 20 years later, they're a reality. Star Trek talks about warp drive. Right now, people have theories on how it may be possible. You need infinite energy, but it could be possible, right? But it's this idea of taking science fiction and moving it further. So it's kind of fun now, right? We have a lot of different directions that we can go. So the first thing we had are the idea of puzzles, right? These basic technical operations. We link them up with something more complex. Those are our knots, with this idea of story. And we put those together and we get games. And we add technology, we get video games. What do we do now? And I think kind of the end part of my lecture is trying to see where we can go with this now, right? We have this idea of science fiction, or really just fiction. It doesn't have to be science fiction. When we're dealing with technology, it tends to go that direction. And we add that to games, and we add that to story, and we add that to pure research. And what we get out of that are unlimited possibilities. If we can actually take these gamified systems and we can utilize them in the way that we can utilize a design fiction, could we do more with them than that? So ultimately what we get from it is this. We get those page turners, and maybe in some way we can virtualize what Einstein did when he imagined himself moving alongside of a beam of light that kind of started the entire revolution. And that's what I have. Thank you.